It gives me great pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Jameson, better known as Betsy, who holds the Imperial Oil Lincoln Mackay Chair in American Studies at the University of Calgary. Her research interests include the histories of the American and Canadian Wests and comparisons between them, women's history and working class history. Her books include All That Glitters, Class, Conflict, and Community in Cripple Creek, and Building Colorado, The United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners of America in the Centennial State. It's quite a long title. And the edited collections with Susan Armitage, The Women's West and Writing, The Range, Race, Class, and Culture in the Women's West, and with Sheila McManus, One Step Over the Line towards a history of women in the North American Wests. She has served as president of the Pacific Coast branch of the American Historical Association and on the governing councils of the Canadian Historical Association, the Western History Association, and the Labour and Working Class History Association. She also serves on the editorial board of the journal Labour Le Travail. So I think we're very, very lucky in having Betsy join us today to present an overview and an account of labour history. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Betsy Jameson.
Well, can you hear me? Thank you for that introduction. Thank you to ALHI, both for all your work over the years and for putting this conference together. Thank you to James and Gil and Dave, and I think thank you to Alvin, who actually invited me to do this morning. I was both honored and a little bit puzzled, actually, when Alvin asked me to speak today, because I am an American historian and my work is mostly about women and workers in the United States West. Although I usually don't admit it on first meeting, I grew up in Texas. I've learned from every other historian in this room, but I cannot begin to match their knowledge of Canadian labor, and I won't try this morning. And I certainly don't share the expertise of working people and union organizers who are here, who make labor history every day on the ground and in your work. So what intrigued me particularly about today's program was the story circles, and I look forward to learning more from you after I finish speaking today. Today, what I want to do is really reflect with you on the importance of stories. I'm going to share a bit of my story and the stories of some of the working people whose histories I do know, and then reflect on the importance of stories for people's histories and people's movements. I take as my touchstone essentially what Gil just said. One of my favorite heroes, Mother Jones, used to say, "Pray for the dead and fight like hell for the living." We're here to celebrate the past, but come up with a history that will nourish us as we fight for the living. Movements begin with stories. The labor movement is rooted in material conditions and in unequal power, but we begin to understand the human costs of class and to envision a better social order and to strategize for change as we share our stories. Storytelling is a relationship. It takes a narrator and a listener. It's a collective project from the beginning. When people come together in a common space, on a shop floor, an assembly line or killing floor, in a bar, around a kitchen table, in a union hall, when we meet in those places and share our stories, seemingly personal situations become collective. Our stories help us identify common issues and also help us see differences that we must respect, like the differences that race and gender make in our working lives. I first experienced the transforming power of stories in the first women's group that I joined, kicking and screaming and holding my breath till I turned blue, in 1968. As I hesitantly voiced feelings that I didn't easily share, like thinking that I had the only body in the world that didn't fit the image of a Playboy centerfold, or being angry when a boss told me that my work was terrific, but I should dress better for my all-male coworkers. He did. I was working at the Riot Commission studying racial inequality at the time. As I told stories that seemed silly or scary, and as other women shared similar feelings and experiences, we began to see that our stories had common social roots. The hard rock miners that I studied had similar conversations about dangerous work and exploitative bosses as they worked together underground and shared the skills and the dangers of a job that made other men rich. At night, in their bunkhouses and in their cabins, they shared books and labor journals that helped them make common sense and common cause out of their grievances. Each of us probably has some aha moment when someone else's story helped us make sense of our own lives and moved us to action. Movements begin with these stories. History begins with stories as well. The history we write and the history we learn depends on whose stories we record and how we weave them into the story of a collective past. Do we write about kings and soldiers, steel workers, nurses, farmers, or domestic workers? Are our sources in the archives, in the ALHI oral histories, in the memory of the person sitting next to us? Who makes history? Whose stories do we hear? Whose stories do we teach our children? Movements begin with stories. They draw strength from the stories of past struggles and victories, and we can learn and build as well from the stories of defeats, mistakes, backlash, and reaction. We're challenged to find the stories and imagine the histories that speak to working people's needs today and that can serve as springboards for a better future. This is the story that began my journey to bring me to stand here before you today. My dad was a veterinarian in my hometown of Galveston, Texas. When I was 3 years old, I drove with him to the cleaners to pick up the intern jackets that he wore every day at work. But when we got to the cleaners, there were 3 pickets in front of the door. My dad somehow managed to explain to a 3-year-old why we were not going to get his jackets that day and why we would never, ever cross a picket line. That was my introduction to and thank my dad. That was my introduction to organized labor. Galveston was just across the bay from the oil refineries in Texas City, and my political education continued in the Texas City OCAW Hall. There were 3 major industries in Galveston. There was a port, and there was a medical school, and there was tourism. You were either a longshoreman's kid or a doctor's kid. Galveston was a quarter African American. It was a 1/5 Latino. The overlapping inequalities of race and class were inescapable. Galveston County at that time was the 2nd most unionized county in Texas. Yet I can't remember a single teacher who used the word class or who talked about work. I learned a history of battles, dates, and kings, of Civil War generals, of Stephen F. Austin, the first president of the Republic of Texas. The history I learned was like a shot of Novocaine to my brain. It didn't connect the world I lived in to anything, and in some ways deadened me to it, blinded me to it. No history book mentioned Stephen F. Austin's slaves or suggested that they were workers whose labor built Texas. It wasn't till I got to college and learned that history could be about so-called ordinary people that I began to get excited about histories that spoke to human needs and human power. I tell these stories to introduce where I come from, to establish some common ground, I hope, between Alberta labor and an interloping historian from Texas. Stories can do that sometimes. In the early 1970s, when I was studying to become a historian, I read a passage in Ralph Ellison's novel, Invisible Man, that seemed to sum up for me the responsibilities and the challenges of history. The Invisible Man had just witnessed a cop murder an organizer named Clifton, who would become, he said, one of the, quote, faceless faces, the soundless voices lying outside history. Where were the historians today, he asked. He tried to step away from it, he said, and look at it from a distance of words read in books, half remembered. For history records the pattern of men's lives, they say. Who slept with whom and with what results, who fought and who won, and who lived to lie about it afterwards. All things, it is said, are duly recorded, all things of importance, that is, but not quite. For actually it's only the known, the seen, the heard, and only those events that the recorder regards as important that are put down. Those lies his keepers keep their power by. Those lies his keepers keep their power by. But the cop would be Clifton's historian, his judge, his witness, and his executioner, and I was the only brother in the watching crowd. Where were the historians today, and how would they put it down? I remembered those words a few years later as I lugged my tape recorder to the Cripple Creek Gold Mining District, a place that between two crucial strikes in 1894 and 1903-04 was a vibrant center of a radical labor community. Over half the workers were organized, and then in 1903-04, they risked and lost it all in a strike to support smelter workers who were trying to establish a union to smelt the ores they dug out of the ground. This was one of a series of brutal strikes that became known as the Colorado Labor Wars. Seeking people who remembered the Union era, I found mostly elderly women, both because Union miners were blacklisted in the district after 1904, and because miners tend to die before their wives do. Part of how I think about activist history came from one of the women I interviewed, May McConaughey Wing. May's father, a mining hoist engineer named James McConaughey, migrated from Ireland to Colorado to BC, back to Colorado, and then to Nevada. May, the keeper of family memory, was born in Leadville, Colorado in 1890, then followed her dad to Cripple Creek, to Roslyn, to the Coeur d'Alenes, and back to Cripple Creek. She lived most of her 90 years there, the daughter, wife, and mother of hard rock miners. Her son Ralph, who worked as a miner and an assayer in Cripple Creek, retired from the Rocky Flats nuclear weapons facility. May's family story crossed international borders and 3 generations of men who did some of the most dangerous work that Western economies could offer. May began our first conversation, as did every woman I interviewed, with, "Why do you want to talk to me? I never did anything." And yet, as May talked and I listened, something shifted in how she viewed her life, or at least how she represented it. By our 3rd or 4th interview, she said something she might secretly have thought all along. She said, "I live the history that I can tell. And of course, the history today in books that's written a lot is not really the true thing as it was lived." Recording her stories was a first step in reimagining a collective history with new actors and new voices. May Wing helped me think about work differently, about the connections between men's work and women's work, between paid and unpaid labor. Like all the women I interviewed, she cooked on a coal or a wood stove. She carried and heated water for baths for men on different shifts at the mines. She did the family baking. She sewed and mended, raised and processed vegetables at high altitudes, nursed sick kids and an injured husband, earned money by keeping boarders and cooking and doing laundry. During the strike, the women made do on strike pay and held entertainments and dances to raise strike funds. They secretly distributed strike relief, evading the militia that occupied their towns. They raised bail bonds and fed imprisoned miners. Their kids threw rocks at soldiers and yelled at scabs. Yet they were barely visible in the Union-centered histories of the Colorado Labor Wars, and those battles were barely visible in U.S. history books. The connection between resistance and family was clear as May Wing fondly remembered the strike heroism of her grandmother, Catherine Doran, and her aunts, Mary Doran and Hannah Welch. She said, "I did have an uncle that lived in Goldfield. His name was Ed Doran, and Grandma was there. Aunt Mary was expecting. But Uncle Ed, of course, got out. Well, he got word that they were going to raid the house. Of course, the militia had the way of doing. In the middle of the night, they'd come after the men and take them to the bullpen, and then they'd send them out. But Uncle Ed got word that they were going to come that night, so he left. Grandma never said just exactly where he went or where he hid. But she was there, and they came, and they tore that house to pieces. They even looked in the bread box. Well, that got Grandma's goat. And she said, sure, and he's not little enough to put in the bread box. Now every God bless it one of you get out of this house and leave this woman alone. She said, you can see the condition she's in. Now she said, get. Then I had another aunt that lived there. Her name was Hannah Welch. And she had 2 great big butcher knives. And she kept those knives razor sharp. And she always said if one of those militiamen ever come in her house in the middle of the night, they'd leave with less than they brought in. Hannah Welch helped me rethink working class activism. I began with an idea that activism is something done in public, on the picket line, in the voting booth, in mines and factories and union halls, and in the streets. But Hannah Welch and May Wing taught me that home is a workplace, and there is no clear divide between work and family, sanitation and safety, class, race, and gender. For them, activism began at home, with demands for running water and the union men who brought sick relief for their injured husbands. It began with keeping your knives razor sharp. It begins too, I think, with the work of memory. Many of the stories that I recorded in Cripple Creek had never been shared, even with family, because to do so would have endangered men's jobs in a district that blacklisted union miners. But when I showed up, the mines had closed and the survivors wanted to record their stories before they were lost forever. The stories of the faceless faces, soundless voices lying outside history seldom made it into archives. They were mostly preserved by people like Hannah Welch and May Wing, who witnessed the events and lived the history that they could tell. Where were the historians today? I lived the history that I can tell. These challenges still speak to me. Whose stories are we recording? Whose history should we tell in what Calgary Herald columnist Stephen Ewart recently called a historically bad year in Canadian labor relations? How do the stories of people who live the history that they can tell speak to today's realities? Labor's recent history poses difficult issues for workers and for their historians. And to repeat the litany that we probably all know, a hardly exhaustive list includes, in no particular order, declining proportions of organized workers, threats to hard-won rights to organize, to strike, to bargain collectively, assaults on hard-won benefits like unemployment insurance, health care, and the 8-hour day, and an unfair share for labor of Alberta's prosperity and resources. The changing structure of the workforce with declining jobs in unionized manufacturing and increases in service work brings us to this historic moment when, for the first time, the majority of organized workers, almost 52%, are women, most of whose jobs pay less than men's. For those of us who work in higher education, there are specific challenges in institutions that are increasingly tied to corporate agendas, where job security, tenure, academic freedom, and the value of history and other liberal arts are all being eroded. Today, the Canadian workforce is less than a third organized, 31%, but it's still more than twice as organized as the United States, where the figure is 13.5% and falling. This difference is explained largely by public sector unionism. Only 17% of Canadian private sector workers are organized, but 74% of Canada's public sector workers belong to unions, compared to 37% in the United States. In both countries, this strongest segment of the organized workforce is under increasing attack. The manufacturing sector, which used to be the most unionized sector of the Canadian workforce, is now half the size of healthcare and smaller than education by some 200,000 jobs. And the organized workers are aging. Those of us over 45 are most likely to be unionized, about 37% of us, while those who are 24 years old or younger are only about 16% organized. How do we connect the stories of historic labor victories and sobering losses with the lived histories of today's workers, the unorganized youth, the underpaid women, the public and service sector workers whose jobs prohibit strikes or make it hard to muster public support? Histories of industrial workers and of hard-fought strikes still inspire me, but we may need new frameworks and narratives to make them speak to today's unorganized majority. We are challenged to guard labor's strength in the public sector, to protect the service workers who teach, heal, and protect us, to defend rights like unemployment insurance and the right to protest, and to contest labor's unequal benefits from Alberta's prosperity. And then there's the challenge of Alberta politics and of Alberta's place in the Canadian labor movement. I live in the least organized province in Canada. Only a bit over 23% of Alberta's workers belong to unions. Whenever this depresses me, which is whenever I think about it, I remember that I could still live in Texas. But I'm also sobered by the attacks south of the border on public sector workers and the dismal US unionization rates. Because just as capital can export manufacturing jobs, it can import strategies to attack labor. In the least unionized province in Canada, I must still happily belong to a faculty union. But like public school teachers, we can't strike. At the U of C, as throughout Canada, sessionals do an increasing proportion of the teaching, and we pay them less per course than we pay their graduate teaching assistants. 63% of Canada's underpaid sessionals are women. Only 19% of full professors are. At the U of C, women faculty earn 85% of what men earn. Sessional teaching jobs, which were once apprenticeships that might lead to full-time work, are now mostly dead-end, low-paid piecework that too many influential Canadians consider the wave of the future. Do Alberta's parents know the stories of the part-timers who educate our kids? Do they know the art and music teachers whose programs are no longer funded? Or the poor and special needs kids who can't afford frills like special education or music or the chance to go on school field trips? In February, we heard the voices of Alberta's healthcare support workers who held out for better benefits and better wages than the 2% annual raises Alberta Healthcare Services offered them. Over 600 workers staged a wildcat strike here in Edmonton. People like Royal Alexandra Hospital cleaning staff employees Al Peltier and Colleen Buzekovich, whose name I hope I didn't just mangle. We just want a fair wage. 2% just doesn't cut it, Peltier said. I've been there for 40 years and I still make under $20 an hour. We're not getting anywhere with Alberta Health Services. They don't respect us. They tell us we're an important part of healthcare, but yet they treat us like slaves. The fact that the walkout interrupted medical procedures sparked angry public reaction. One woman slapped a microphone out of Colleen Buzekovich's hand. She said, I can understand that. Patient care is suffering, but we're also suffering. We're the backbone of the hospital and we're taken for granted. The hospital workers highlight the challenges for organized service workers whose right to strike was denied by the Klein government, which declared their work an essential service. And indeed it is. So are teachers, firefighters, police officers, sanitation workers, and air traffic controllers. It's easy to raise public concern and public anger about delayed medical care, closed schools, piles of garbage, and canceled flights. It's easy to demonize workers who might withhold such essential services. The right to strike is under siege from the Harper government, which has used back-to-work legislation to undermine workers at Air Canada, Canada Post, and the CPR to prevent an immediate and serious danger to the safety or health of the public. Labor Minister Lisa Raitt wants to change the labor code to define the economy as an essential service, a move that, okay. And if she succeeds, if that happens, that will protect the rights of capital to profits, and it will virtually end the strike as an effective labor tactic. Her attitude became clear in the strike of Calgary-based CPR workers. Simply put, she said, the strike can't go on. We need to get the trains running again. The CPR demanded up to a 40% cut in the earned pensions of unionized employees after posting a $570 million profit last year, according to the Teamsters Canada Rail Conference. We spent our entire careers paying for this, contributing to this, and relying on this pension plan, said Union Vice President and Chief Negotiator Doug Finson. And because the shareholders want increased value, they want to squeeze it out of our pension plan. The story of building the CPR West to link the new nation is told in every Canadian history text and every survey course. Which historians will connect that story to this one? Who will connect rate statements to another time and place when the trains just had to run on time? Most of us have gone to school or have kids or maybe even remember free field trips. Most of us want adequate health care. Most of us want our parents or ourselves treated with dignity as we age. Most of us want to be safe on our streets, on our rail lines, and when we fly the sometimes not so friendly skies. Our history should help us hear the Alberta workers who provide all of these services. I can find quotes from Al Peltier and Colleen Buzekovich and Doug Finson online in press reports, but I don't know their stories yet. I'd like to think that if Albertans heard them, that might affect policy. And I'd like to think that if we all heard enough of these stories, we might come up with new organizing strategies to meet their needs. Here are some of the stories of labor struggles that got me thinking about what to do when the right to strike is challenged. When the grad assistants at the University of Michigan tried to organize a union in 1974, they knew that the university would do without their labor forever rather than recognize the union. So they got the Teamsters to refuse to cross the picket lines. And as the garbage piled up and the toilet paper ran out, an administration that did not care about teaching assistants came to the bargaining table. And I think of the Salt of the Earth strike in New Mexico, when a court ordered the striking union Latino miners not to picket. And their wives and other women took over the picket lines because they were not union members and therefore were not covered by the court order. What if hospital workers and teachers didn't picket, but their supporters did, and the Teamsters honored the picket lines? What if, totally spontaneously and without conspiring, of course, what if teachers picketed for healthcare workers or parents and students picketed for teachers? I don't know if it's legal. I don't know if it would work. You may have better ideas. It's just what came to mind Tuesday night as I was typing these stories, and I thought about the services that matter to me and the rights that I don't want to lose. One of the most frustrating conversations I have as an American in Alberta is with folks who want me to confirm their fantasy that we need a two-tier system of medical care more like the American health care that they think is superior to our own. I grew up with American medicine. I grew up in a community where the biggest employer was a medical school and a hospital that paid medical specialists obscenely high salaries and the African American women who emptied bedpans obscenely low ones. The U.S. has a two-tier system, the insured and the uninsured. I don't want to go back there. And I don't want a world where unemployment benefits are not acknowledged as a right that I earn. I remember when I needed them. From 1978 to 1984, I ran the Women's Studies programs at Loretto Heights College in Denver, founded by the Sisters of Loretto, a bunch of radical nuns who started a research center on women in 1962. By the time I got there, they had left the convent, taken off their habits, and turned the college over to a lay board of trustees. But not before they unionized and won certification in 1972. We had the only certified bargaining unit in Colorado higher education. On February 20th, 1980, we were in bargaining when the U.S. Supreme Court handed down its decision in National Labor Relations Board versus Yeshiva University, which denied the bargaining rights to the yeshiva faculty by upholding their administration's claim that faculty are managerial or supervisory personnel because we have input into tenure decisions and other administrative matters like supervising our grad assistants. Our administration walked out of negotiations with us claiming that we too were managers. We challenged their action with the support of the NEA, which sank over $100,000 into supporting our tiny local. And a Reagan administration National Labor Relations Board panel ruled that any managerial rights that we had won through collective bargaining, and the administration could not take from us the union representation that had won those rights. The U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals upheld that decision on September 4th, 1984, and a tiny faculty local won the first major qualification to the yeshiva decision. This was no small victory in 1984. We were working under an administration that had led the way in busting public sector unions during the PATCO strike by breaking the Air Traffic Controllers Union, which was the only union that in fact had supported Ronald Reagan for president. There are ironies everywhere. We won a great victory, and I should have led the celebration in the fall of '84. I'd been elected president of the Faculty Education Association for that academic year. But in June of 1984, the Loretto Heights administration abolished my job. Abolishing the women's programs in what had been a pioneering women's college turned out to be the opening shot in a plan that ended with the sale of the financially solvent college to a Denver Jesuit institution. The trustees, in fact, had had enough of bargaining with radical nuns. So I collected unemployment benefits while I looked for work. I had to apply for 5 jobs a week, so I wrote letters to every community college in the United States asking if they had jobs, but I was not forced to take a job outside my field. And when I found a job in a deli and I taught part-time all over Denver, it was to keep a career and a family going, not because the unemployment office made me take part-time work. There are 2 major components to every story. There are actors and there are plots. Many of us have worked to add new voices and new actors to history, to hear and record the voices of people who lived the history that they can tell us. The ALHI oral histories are a rich resource for new labor histories. The harder task in some ways is coming up with new plots, of choosing the right plot for the present moment. The story of the Loretto Heights faculty's resistance to the yeshiva decision could end at the moment of triumph in September of 1984. For the rights of organized faculty, it was and it remains a significant victory. Or that story could go on to the moment I got fired and the college got sold, and end as a sobering cautionary tale about the fragility of victories and the need always to be vigilant against reaction and backlash. That too is a useful story. Or could trace the histories of the faculty who were dispersed when the college closed and the students whose educations got disrupted, and become a more complicated story of lessons learned, of accommodation and endurance, and of how the experience affected each of us as we moved on. The changing structure of the workforce means that many workers in some of the most unionized jobs have been imperfectly connected to labor histories about industrial workers and their strikes. But the histories of industrial workers were also connected to changes in service work that accompanied industrialization. They were linked to employers' reliance on unpaid domestic labor that made it possible for men to get up and go to the woods or mines or factories every day. They were linked to the removal of service work from households to the wage sector in the form of boarding houses, laundries, schools, hospitals, and senior citizens' homes, and the entry into the paid workforce of women who worked outside their homes to support themselves and their families. Today's labor histories need to connect today's workforce with the history of changes in the nature, locations, and rewards of service work and in the labor of caring. In a history for today's challenges, I would begin, as I did today, with women like May Wing, whose unpaid labor as cooks, healers, and seamstresses and community organizers underwrote employers' profits and union organizing. I'd begin with women talking in sod houses on the prairies about organizing to build a school or a library. The labor histories I first learned told of men who struggled, understandably and admirably, to achieve a family wage that would keep their wives and kids out of the paid workforce. While honoring their struggles and their goals, labor histories today can show that these workers lived in interdependent households, and it can connect with the value of domestic labor and service work in the past to people who work in the public and service sectors today. Storytelling is important work. So I'd like to tell one more about how claiming a story for historical memory transformed a labor defeat into a source of strength and inspiration. This story begins September 23rd, 1913, when 9,000 miners walked off their jobs in the coal towns that stretched south along the Front Range of the Rockies. They struck 3 companies, the largest of which was Colorado Fuel and Iron, and was controlled by the Rockefellers. They struck for simple things. They struck for union recognition, an 8-hour day, increased tonnage rates, a check weighman, an end to company stores, company houses, and company doctors. Knowing that they would be evicted from company housing, the United Mine Workers erected tent colonies, including one at Ludlow, where evicted families created a cooperative community of 27 nationalities. Slim Evans, who I've begun to think of as sort of the Forrest Gump of the labor movement because he shows up everywhere important. Slim Evans was at Ludlow, and I want to thank Maria Dunn for turning me on to his story. So, as it happened in many, many miners' struggles in Colorado, the militia was called out and occupied the area. And on April 20th, 1914, soldiers shot and killed 3 union organizers and an 11-year-old boy and shot into the tent colony and then burned it. 2 women and 11 children suffocated in a pit that had been dug to provide shelter from gunfire. And the event known as the Ludlow Massacre ignited a literal class war that raged throughout southern Colorado until federal troops intervened. The bloody climax crushed the UMW in the southern coalfields and also presented John D. Rockefeller with a bit of a PR problem. He met this by hiring Mackenzie King as a labor consultant who invented the company union as Rockefeller's strategy to appear more labor-friendly. Rockefeller may have won the battle, but the union seized the terrain of memory. It bought the site of the tent colony, and on May 30th, 1916, 3,000 people gathered there to dedicate a statue and a monument to the dead. There was a cenotaph that has the names of all the people who were killed there, and a statue of a miner and a woman holding a baby. There have been annual memorials services held there ever since, and the visitors' registers that the union kept there at the site has become an invaluable archive of working class memories. Then, on May 8, 2003, the union caretaker found to his horror that the heads of both figures had been severed from their bodies and the woman's arm had been cut off. As the news went out, the Labor and Working Class History Association created a committee that I was privileged to chair to get the Ludlow site declared a National Historic Landmark. Now, this isn't easy. There are fewer than 2,500 National Historic Landmarks in the States, and only 3 of them at the time commemorated labor struggles. But finally, on January 16, 2009, the Secretary of the Interior officially designated the Ludlow Tent Colony site as a National Historic Landmark, and on June 28th of that year, we gathered at Ludlow for the official plaquing ceremony. When I spoke at the plaquing ceremony, I intended to close, as I had often done, with one of the people who lived the history there. Her name was Mary Petrucci. Born in a coal mining family, raised in a company house, educated at a company school, Mary Petrucci married at 16 a man who loaded boxcars for a coal company in Walsenburg, Colorado. The morning of April 20th, 1914, Mary Petrucci was doing the laundry when her tent was set on fire. She ran with her children and got them safely into the pit that was to shelter them. When she regained consciousness, she was holding her dead infant and was surrounded by the corpses of her friends, their children, and her own. Mary Petrucci was not simply a powerless victim. She chose to be at Ludlow, and she tried to find meaning in her loss. She told a reporter after the strike, quote, "I'm 24 years old, and I suppose I'll live a long time, but I don't see how I can ever be happy again. But you're not to think that we could do it any differently another time. We are working people, my husband and I, and we're stronger for the union than before the strike. I can't have my babies back, but perhaps when everybody knows about them, something will be done to make the world a better place for all babies." On the way to the plaquing ceremony, I was told that a man named Frank Petrucci would be there. I had not known that 5 years after the massacre, the Petruccis began having children again. They had 7 more, and they named the first 4 after the children who had died during the strike. Frank, who was then 90, was named for the infant who died in his mother's arms. I went to him before the ceremony, and I told him that I'd intended to talk about his mother, and I hoped that was okay with him. As I spoke, I looked straight into Frank Petrucci's eyes, and I saw nothing else. It was the most powerful moment I have ever known as a historian. After the ceremony, Frank ran up and hugged me and said, "You got it right. I love you. Let's have lunch and talk." So we ate and we told stories. I hope that we never, did I just lose my mic? I hope that we never suffer another Ludlow, but I also hope that we find in today's challenges, as in the histories of the first 100 years of Alberta labor, I'm okay. I hope that, I'm in my last paragraph, I'm just not going to use the mic. I hope that we find in these challenges, as we found in the labor stories of the past, the memories that will sustain us in the struggles ahead. Because the work of memory matters. Movements are sustained with stories. These are some of mine, and now it's your turn.